Oftentimes, I browse r/EDH, sorted by new. As an aside, if you see the Trinket Mage, that's me. And commonly, there are posts where someone says, help me with my deck. And I like to click on their lists and check it out. One of the things that I commonly recommend, though, is to add Graveyard Hate, since many people will often have none. And plenty of times, I'm met with a resounding why. Many players will say, why waste a slot on Graveyard Hate when you could further your own strategy? Or why play Graveyard Hate if you're only going to play one piece? And these are totally valid questions. I'll answer both of them in this video. But first, if you haven't subscribed already, I'd really appreciate it if you did. Let's start with why. Well, for starters, there's a lot of powerful graveyard strategies out there. Reanimator, Aristocrats, or just any Sultai pile. These decks are really powerful and very difficult to deal with if you can't exile their graveyard. They're going to repeatedly recur and reuse the same pieces that you use your removal on over and over again, and eventually you'll run out of removal. And that's well and good. Most people understand that if you're up against Muldrotha or Tasigur, exiling their graveyard is powerful. But people might say, well, I don't run into Reanimator decks that often, or graveyard decks in general. What if I play against decks that don't use their graveyard? And I think those don't really exist. It is extremely likely that one of your three opponents will have an Eternal Witness, or Academy Ruins, or an Underworld Breach, or many of the other cards that come back from the yard, or are cast from the yard. I mean, think about it. Flashback, Jumpstart, Disturb, Retrace, and plenty of creatures just bring themselves back. I feel like people assume that if they're not up against a Reanimator deck or Aristocrats deck, no graveyard shenanigans are happening. Like, you'll be hard-pressed to find an artifact deck that isn't running Goblin Welder or Scrap Mastery. But I'm willing to bet you that if you look at your decks, they probably use the graveyard in some small way. It might be only a few cards, like a Crucible effect, but that still means you're using the graveyard. You still might be unconvinced though. Even if it's effective, why play something like Leyline of the Void or Rest in Peace instead of a card that assists you? Well, unless you're running Helm combo, I actually don't think Leyline or Rest in Peace are very good in casual Commander. This is not the Graveyard Hate you should be playing. Rest in Peace is a card that will mess you up since you're probably playing some Graveyard Recursion as well, and Leyline of the Void provides no additional utility. Instead, you should be playing Graveyard Hate that's either almost free to include or offers other utility. Let's talk about the free includes first. Majuka Bog is one of the easiest cards to include in your deck. Take a swamp out of your deck, throw it away, put in the bog. Done. If you draw the card early game, it's just a tapped swamp. But then in the late game, if you play up against the Sultai, my graveyard is also my hand deck, this is a uncounterable way to just hose them. After they fill up their graveyard, slamming this down and exiling 20 plus cards is devastating. And if you're not in black, you can also play Scavenger Grounds, which enters untapped and basically does the same thing, as it can exile graveyards. These are very easy to add to almost any deck. The other free includes are baubles. These are some of my favorites for unbiased Trinket Mage reasons. Stone of Eric? How do you pronounce that? Does anybody know? Let me know in the comments. And Soul Guide Lantern are both cheap artifacts that can exile graveyards, but also draw a card. This means if you draw them in the late game, and you're not up against a graveyard deck, nobody has anything relevant in their yard, or you're not looking to exile anything, you can just spend a little bit of mana, draw a new card, and keep going. You don't lose that much, and now you have access to this powerful tool in your deck. But even though those are free and easy to add, it's even better to instead play cards that fit your theme. Scavenging Ooze and Lion Sash are good examples of this. If you're playing a +1/+1 counter deck, these creatures are great. If you're playing an equipment deck, the Sash works for that theme. And Ooze usually gains you a decent amount of life. So if you're playing a life gain deck, especially one that wants multiple instances of life gain, then the Ooze is a great addition. But there are more. Alright, lightning round. I'm going to go through these quickly. Deathrite Shaman goes in your elf decks. Verdant Command goes in your squirrel decks. Primal Command is a creature tutor that does a few things but can also shuffle a graveyard into an opponent's deck, which can really mess up graveyard decks. Calamity's Wake is a silence effect that lets you protect your creature-based combos, but can also hose graveyard decks, and stop other combo decks as well. Cremate is a sweet cantrip for Spellslinger decks that can also remove a reanimation target when needed. Removal, like Rakdos Charm or Return to Nature, also exile cards from graveyards. Farewell is one of the best board wipes in the format, and it also exiles all yards. Withered Wretch is a zombie and cleric, if you want to use those tribes. And if you're zombies, Invasion of Innistrad is removal that can make zombies on the flip side by exiling cards from graveyards. Agatha's Soul Cauldron is a powerful combo piece that is also good yard hate. Dothy Voidwalker shuts down death triggers and is an insanely powerful card. Blessed Respite is a fog that also shuffles a yard into their deck. Puppeteer Click can let you steal your opponent's reanimation targets. Erebos' Intervention is removal and life gain, or it can exile cards from graveyards. Ethereal Absolution is an anthem that also makes tokens when it exiles stuff from graveyards. It also weakens your opponent's creatures. It's a pretty neat card. Reveteer's Charm can draw cards and exile yards. Crypt Incursion can gain you a ton of life. If the graveyard player has 10 creatures in their yard, you gain 30 life at instant speed. That's amazing. And it's doubly good if you're a mill deck. Kai's Guile can make spirits for a spirit deck, or gain you life. It's also an Edict. Damn, this card is really good, and you can entwine it to get all of these effects. I gotta play this card more. Lastly, Unite the Coalition is like a 5-color super charm that does a bunch of random things. It can also exile a yard. These cards all answer the other questions. Why play Graveyard Hate if you're only going to play one instead of something that furthers your strategy? Because it can be both. You can play a card that furthers your strategy and is also Graveyard Hate incidentally, meaning you can still put +1/+1 counters on a creature to trigger all of those related effects and exile graveyards at the same time. The opportunity cost is almost nothing. It's so easy to fit one of the lands in your deck. You can just play one of the cards that I mentioned before in your deck, whichever one fits your theme, and boom, you have Graveyard Hate without losing a single slot in your deck. But does it even matter? Many players will argue if you only have one copy of something in your deck, why have it at all? Since most games, you won't even see it. This is why elf decks play 9 lords instead of 1. Now, this topic could be its own separate video. Maybe I'll make a whole video about deck thinning or the stats behind finding cards, etc. But if we slim down the scope of that video to just Graveyard Hate, for starters, it's not always one copy. You might have tutors that help you find these pieces, or maybe you're playing Bajuka Bog plus Scavenger Ooze in your deck. But also, unlike things like basic removal, which you need early game oftentimes if somebody gets off to a fast start, or they put out a hate piece you can't deal with easily, you don't really need Graveyard Hate till later in the game. If someone's going to reanimate something very quickly, one spot removal piece is probably all you need. Graveyard Hate is best at slowing down graveyard decks once they've filled their yard, when they have many things going on in the graveyard being looped and drawn and sacrificed. So you have many more turns in a game to find your Graveyard Hate before you actually need to play it. Nobody's casting Scrap Mastery or Living Death on turn 5, and if there's one Muldrotha player at the table, you don't need to be the one to draw the hate piece. Your opponents might as well. If I'm playing Heliod and you're playing Muldrotha, my opponent is probably going to exile your graveyard over mine. So if they do that, I don't really need my Graveyard Hate. So if everybody's playing one in their deck, it's going to show up often enough that it'll probably be relevant most games. So those are the reasons I play Graveyard Hate in every single one of my casual EDH decks, and it shows up in enough games to clutch up wins for me. Because at the end of the day, sometimes your Tormod script is a door to nothingness against a Muldrotha player, and that's like the most mana efficient way to beat a player. Let me know what Graveyard Hate you play in your decks. And if you don't play any in your decks, why not? I feel like you really should, but if you don't, I'd like to hear you out in the comments below. Thanks for watching, subscribe for more.